In over 4,000 years of galactic history, only 7 members of Yoda's species have ever been recorded. No homeworld, no species name, no explanation for their connection to the Force. But 2 of those 7 might actually be the same being, and a pre-production naming choice sits in unresolved tension with Lucasfilm's canonical record over which and that unresolved tension changes everything. The Star Wars universe is one of the most obsessively documented fictional worlds ever constructed. Canonical encyclopedias cover the molecular composition of starship hulls. Official records catalog mid-level Senate bureaucrats who appeared in a single background shot before the editor cut away. Trade routes through backwater systems, dietary habits of species that materialized once in a crowd scene, the childhood trauma of Sith apprentices who didn't survive their second season of screen time. The documentation apparatus of this universe is staggering in its comprehensiveness. Run a query on Yoda species, and the file is essentially empty. 7 beings across 4 millennia of recorded civilization. No name, no planet, no lineage. Just 7 faces and a silence that deepens every time you try to trace its edges. That 7 members figure draws from both current Disney canon and the older Legends continuity, the pre-2014 expanded universe that Lucasfilm officially declared non-canonical after the Disney acquisition restructured the franchise. In strict current canon, only 3 confirmed members of the species exist: Yoda, Yaddle, and Grogu. The remaining members, including the specific individual sitting at the center of this investigation, live in Legends. For some questions, the canon wall is decisive. For this one, the pattern itself is the point, and the pattern holds regardless of which continuity you're standing in when you examine it. George Lucas made a deliberate, documented, creative decision to permanently suppress the species name, homeworld, and origins of Yoda's kind. No answer he could give to those questions would be more compelling than the absence of one. That was his explicit reasoning. It sounds like a thoughtful author protecting a mystery. Yoda spent over 800 years at the absolute center of galactic power. Yaddle served on the Jedi High Council in the Republic's capital. Grogu, at 50 years old, developmentally an infant, survived Order 66 through means even his own fragmented memory can't fully reconstruct. These beings shaped the outcome of wars that determined the fate of billions, and the official record on their origins contains nothing. Sustaining that level of institutional silence across 40 years and 2 ownership regimes of a franchise that documents everything else requires more than authorial restraint. Somebody built that silence carefully, and built it to last. One acknowledgment is owed before the serious crowd settles in. A comment in the broader conversation around this species generated 363 likes and outperformed every piece of careful lore analysis in the section combined. It said simply, "You forgot about yogurt." If you've spent any time with Mel Brooks' 1987 Spaceballs, you know exactly why that lands. Yogurt is the tiny, ancient, wrinkled, inexplicably wise alien who parodies Yoda with gleeful transparency, and by the species count logic being applied today, he technically clears the threshold. The casual faction of this audience clocked that faster than anyone parsed a piece of KOTOR lore, and they deserve the acknowledgement. The investigation continues. The name Minch enters Star Wars history through Lee Brackett, and it enters quietly, the way things do when they're embedded inside a document most people will never read. In 1977, fresh off the disorienting commercial success of the original film, George Lucas hired one of science fiction's genuine legends to draft the sequel. Brackett's career was extraordinary by any measure. Her pulp sci-fi output dated back to the 1940s. She had a screen credit on The Big Sleep alongside Raymond Chandler. Her body of genre work had shaped American science fiction before Lucas had completed his first short film. She wrote the first full screenplay draft of what would become The Empire Strikes Back, and in that draft, the ancient Jedi Master living in isolation on a swamp planet carried a complete name: Minch Yoda. He was Minch. The character's role in that early draft was broadly similar to what ended up on screen: an aged, diminutive, immensely powerful teacher guiding the young hero toward his destiny. But the naming choice is significant. Brackett wasn't inventing the character from scratch. She was working from Lucas's outline and his vision of who this figure was. Minch Yoda was, in her draft, a full name for a complete individual. Lucas rewrote the script substantially. Lawrence Kasdan came aboard to sharpen the dialogue and structure. Through revision after revision, the old master became simply Yoda, one name, the way certain figures become so singular that a surname starts to feel like clutter. The character retained every essential quality Brackett had developed from Lucas's notes. The name Minch was quietly left behind in the drafts. On its surface, that's a routine production footnote. Characters acquire and lose names in development constantly, and early screenplay drafts carry no canonical weight. Except Minch didn't vanish. It circulated in fandom as a production curiosity for decades, and then roughly 20 years after Empire was released, it resurfaced in a published legend story that assigned the name to a specific character with a specific history. A story in Star Wars Tales Volume 4 introduced a Jedi Knight of Yoda's species, active approximately 700 years before the events of the original trilogy, placing him around 700 BBY on the galactic calendar. His name was Minch. He was depicted as a warrior of formidable force ability, a lone operative moving through the galaxy in an era well before Yoda's own documented lifetime in the records. Wikipedia catalogs Minch as a separate and distinct individual from Yoda, a different being of the same species who happens to share a name that was once, in pre-production, attached to the Grand Master himself. This is where the fracture opens into something that hasn't fully healed. When Lucas dropped Minch from Yoda's name during development, was he setting that name free? Releasing it into the expanded universe to be assigned wherever it fit? Or was he simply shortening the name of his own character, meaning every subsequent Legends reference to Minch is actually a younger Yoda in an earlier chapter of a very long life? The documented positions on this question reveal how deeply it cuts. One voice in the debate carries 96 engagement, so says George Lucas, implying that the original naming intention permanently binds Minch and Yoda as a single, continuous being. A competing voice cites Lucasfilm's official stance as a direct contradiction of that linkage, though that counter-argument drew only 7 engagement. A third position points to Wikipedia's current entry maintaining the separation explicitly, treating the 700 BBY Jedi as fully distinct from the film's 900-year-old Grand Master. 10 engagement behind that view. 3 distinct authorities hold competing positions that refuse to resolve cleanly into each other, and the entity with actual jurisdiction over the answer, Lucasfilm, has chosen not to issue a ruling. The honest framing matters here. The "Lucas says Minch is Yoda" construction is more complicated than a direct quote. What exists is a pre-production naming choice embedded in Brackett's screenplay, not a post hoc statement by Lucas claiming 2 separately canonized characters are the same individual. The contradiction is real, but its shape is institutional rather than biographical. Lucasfilm's licensing arm permitted the Legends continuity to establish Minch as a distinct being. Lucas's own development history suggests the name was always his Grandmaster's first name. Whether those 2 facts can coexist without collapsing into each other is the question that nobody with authority over the franchise has chosen to answer directly. That refusal is itself informative. This franchise has corrected far more trivial continuity errors in far less time. The arithmetic is concrete. If Minch and Yoda are the same being, the species count across all recorded galactic history drops from 7 to 6. 6 beings. 4,000 years. The rarity intensifies, the pattern tightens, and the absence becomes harder to explain as coincidence or lore oversight, because lore oversights get corrected. They don't persist across 2 ownership regimes of the most commercially significant fictional universe on Earth. The concealment pattern requires examining the documented members of this species in sequence, because the distribution of these appearances is as significant as their scarcity. These beings don't appear scattered randomly across the historical record the way background species do. They surface at crisis points, the hinges where galactic fate was being actively negotiated. and then they disappear back into silence when the moment resolves. The deepest record belongs to the Old Republic era. The most complete surviving documentation of this species operating in the field comes from approximately 3,956 years before the Battle of Yavin, the deep past of the Knights of the Old Republic games, a period of civilizational catastrophe that would reshape the Jedi Order and the Republic's relationship to the Force for generations. Master Vandar sat on the Jedi High Council during some of the most devastating conflicts in galactic recorded history. Picture the Dantooine Enclave, built into cliff faces on a quiet agrarian world, stone and shadow, grassland air through narrow windows, the council seated in a circle that manages to feel both intimate and enormous. Vandar sat in those sessions with the quiet weight of someone who had processed more history than his colleagues could fully comprehend. Small in body, precise in movement, speaking rarely and meaning everything when he did. His presence in the KOTOR records is remarkably complete by the standards of this species. A recognized council authority during the Mandalorian Wars, a continuous institutional voice through the Jedi Civil War that followed Revan's fall and eventual return. He remained one of the few senior figures who held together functionally when the Order's leadership structure was fragmenting around him, and his council shaped the decisions that determined whether the Republic survived its most destructive internal conflict. A comment on this era's storytelling quality drew 259 likes, the assessment being that those Old Republic stories are infinitely more interesting than anything produced in the decade leading up to 2025. That's a fair read. The writers of that era were willing to go somewhere genuinely dark. Then comes KOTOR, and the story goes as dark as Star Wars gets. The Jedi Order, gutted by the Jedi Civil War, gathered what remained of its senior leadership on the planet KOTOR for a conclave, a last attempt to assess what the Order still was, and whether it had a future worth planning for. The planet's Miraluka population was already uniquely attuned to the Force, their settlement built around a spiritual connection to the galaxy's energy rather than a political one. The conclave was intended to be private. Darth Nihilus found them anyway. Nihilus was a wound in the Force in the most literal sense the lore allows, a being hollowed out by the Malachor V catastrophe and replaced by an insatiable hunger for Force energy that had no natural ceiling. He didn't deploy an army against KOTOR. He fed. Standing in proximity to that concentrated gathering of Force-sensitive minds, he drew on the Force with an appetite that had no stopping mechanism, consuming the life energy of every living thing on the planet's surface, not just the assembled Jedi, not just the Miraluka who called KOTOR home, but every organism of every kind in contact with the living world. When it was finished, KOTOR was silent in the specific way that nothing alive can produce. Among those consumed was Vandar, one of only a handful of known members of this species across 4 millennia of recorded history, gone in an instant, devoured alongside an entire world. Even the manner of his death tells us nothing about where he came from, what his homeworld was called, or how he originally came to join the Jedi Order. The silence survived the violence that ended him. No council documentation of next of kin. No species elder who emerged afterward to formally acknowledge the loss. He died in the most dramatic possible fashion, a planetary consumption event, and the record of his origins remained as blank the day after KOTOR as it was the day before. Moving forward in the timeline by roughly 3,200 years brings us to Yaddle, and her story is remarkable enough that it demands more than a footnote. The Star Wars Visual Encyclopedia records plainly that during the prequel era, Yoda and Yaddle were the only 2 known examples of their species, 2 beings seated on a council of 12 in the capital of the most sophisticated republic the galaxy had produced, surrounded by an intelligence apparatus that tracked Force-sensitive individuals across thousands of worlds. Her canonical death in Tales of the Jedi fits the character even as it leaves every deeper question unanswered. When Count Dooku makes his early move toward the dark side, Yaddle intervenes to save civilians, choosing sacrifice over her own continuation. The Council loses her, and the record of where she came from remains as blank as the day she first took her seat. Yaddle is the only confirmed female member of the species. That distinction raises a question the documentation consistently refuses to address. How does a species maintain any population when its documented members have been dispersed individually across the galaxy, with no recorded home community, no apparent family structure on file, no one from their kind ever arriving to check on them across centuries of service? Something that attentive viewers have long noted in The Phantom Menace sits in plain sight across 2.5 decades of repeat viewings. The Galactic Senate Chamber on Coruscant is a staggering piece of production design. A vast, circular amphitheater of floating platforms, thousands of delegates from thousands of worlds suspended in a domed space so enormous that individual beings are barely visible from across the room. Among the species represented in that hall, there is a group of small, large-eyed, long-fingered beings that should register immediately for anyone who grew up watching a very different film, because they closely resemble the alien from Steven Spielberg's E.T., the Extraterrestrial. Lucas and Spielberg maintained one of the most documented creative friendships in Hollywood history. Spielberg had already included a child dressed as Yoda in E.T.'s Halloween sequence. Lucas is widely reported to have answered by embedding what appears to be E.T.'s species in the Senate as a recognized diplomatic delegation, a connection that circulates widely in fandom but lacks canonical verification. Reciprocal Easter eggs, a private acknowledgement between filmmakers who understood exactly what each other was doing. In E.T., when the alien encounters the child in the Yoda costume on Halloween, the creature reacts with what reads as specific recognition, not categorization, not curiosity, but the instinctive response of encountering a face it already knows. If you take the Easter egg game seriously as an in-universe gesture, that reaction implies E.T.'s species has direct familiarity with Yoda's kind. The Senate cameo treats E.T.'s species as a legitimate galactic diplomatic delegation, meaning a charted homeworld, recognized political standing, an established presence in Republic institutions. Yoda's species has none of those things on the public record. A civilization apparently from outside the conventionally mapped galactic community can identify Yoda's kind on sight, while the Republic's own intelligence infrastructure has nothing on file. That asymmetry doesn't resolve itself cleanly. The Force Ghost transmission chain is one of those lore details where getting it exactly right matters, and where a common error has been circulating in some coverage of this subject. The claim that Yoda taught Obi-Wan Kenobi how to become a Force Ghost isn't what the canonical record establishes. At the conclusion of Revenge of the Sith, Yoda tells Obi-Wan he will have training during the Tatooine exile, specifically training to commune with Qui-Gon Jinn, whose consciousness had persisted in the Force after his death at Darth Maul's hands in The Phantom Menace. The crucial distinction: Yoda is passing on access to something Qui-Gon discovered, not something Yoda originated. The technique of retaining individual consciousness in the Force after death was developed by Qui-Gon through deep personal study of the living Force, a discipline the Jedi Order had largely abandoned in its more institutionalized, bureaucratic era. Qui-Gon's approach was considered unorthodox by the Council during his lifetime. His insistence on the primacy of the living Force over the unifying Force, a source of ongoing friction with the Order's leadership. That marginalized philosophy turned out to contain the most profound discovery in Jedi history. The transmission chain runs from Qui-Gon to Yoda in terms of the knowledge base, with Yoda then directing Obi-Wan toward Qui-Gon's direct instruction during the years on Tatooine. Yoda acts as conduit and guide. The origin belongs entirely to Qui-Gon. Yoda participated in transmitting a technique that altered the nature of death itself for Jedi practitioners, a discovery that ultimately shaped Luke Skywalker's ability to face the Emperor. Every step in that transmission chain is documented in the canonical record with extraordinary specificity. The file on where Yoda came from remains completely untouched. The contrast between the depth of documentation on what he did and the absolute blankness of where he originated isn't an accident. It's a structural choice, maintained consistently across multiple creative generations and two distinct ownership regimes. Grogu is 50 years old and developmentally an infant. Yoda at 900 was considered ancient. The mathematics of that lifespan mean a single member of this species, in full adult capacity across 8 or 9 centuries, accumulates influence on a timescale no other species in the galaxy can match. Their presence at key moments isn't just numerically significant, it's qualitatively different from the presence of a shorter-lived being. One of them moving through galactic affairs for 800 years touches more history, shapes more outcomes, and occupies more critical positions than any comparable individual of any other species could. A single member of this species isn't just an individual. They're an institution, compounding over centuries. Grogu survived Order 66 through means his own fragmented memory can't cleanly reconstruct. He was found decades later in the Outer Rim, carrying no knowledge of a homeworld, no memory of a community of his kind, no elders who surfaced to reclaim him after the Purge. His history before the Jedi Temple is inaccessible even to him. Dave Filoni, supervising director on The Mandalorian, confirmed explicitly that the show had no plans to reveal Yoda's homeworld. That operates as a strict franchise policy, the same policy Lucas established 4 decades earlier, inherited intact by the creative leadership of a new ownership regime that has otherwise proven willing to excavate and rebuild virtually every other corner of the franchise. The concealment pattern that characterizes every documented member of this species holds in its newest, most publicly visible case. One very small, very force-sensitive being, alone in the galaxy, origin unknown, species unnamed, homeworld uncharted. The absence isn't a failure of documentation, or a placeholder waiting for the right sequel to fill it in. The species has no recorded homeworld because no one in the galaxy has ever appeared to find it. And the most coherent explanation for that, given everything the evidence presents, is that its location is being actively suppressed by the species itself, using the same ability that defines every single one of its documented members. An extraordinarily deep and sophisticated relationship to the Force. The pattern of deployment tells a specific story. Vandar Tokare at the hinge of the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War. Yaddle on the Council during the Republic's final stable decades. Yoda, or possibly Minch in a younger iteration, already a lone operative of formidable Force ability moving through the galaxy 7 centuries before the Clone Wars, without institutional backup. Yoda at the center of everything from the Clone Wars to the last stand against the Emperor. Grogu, the youngest, positioned at the exact moment the galaxy was rebuilding from the Empire's collapse. These aren't random placements. The distribution looks more like a deliberate strategy. Lone members dispatched to positions of maximum influence at maximum crisis points, while the home community remains invisible, unmapped, unreachable by any conventional means. A species with that level of collective Force attunement could conceal a planet, not through technology or political maneuvering, but through the same organic connection to the living Force that makes each individual member so extraordinarily capable. Every hyperspace route that should logically pass near their world leads somewhere else, or nowhere productive. Every mapping expedition returns without coordinates. Every intelligence file on their origins contains a blank where the data should be. The ET species in the Senate chamber apparently recognizes Yoda's kind on sight, which could be explained by proximity. If their homeworld sits close enough to Yoda's species world, that direct contact existed long before the Republic's hyperspace charts reached that region. A civilization deliberately keeping itself off every institutional map, interacting with galactic affairs through the Force, rather than through political incorporation, would look precisely like this. Invisible to governments, visible to neighbors, represented across millennia only by the individuals it chose to send outward into the galaxy's crises. Yoda spent over 800 years training Jedi, asking how a being with that institutional footprint never generated a single documented inquiry into his origins, from a single student, a single archivist, a single intelligence officer, isn't a small question. Thousands of students across centuries of council membership. Nobody filed a report on where he came from? Either the Republic's intelligence services were remarkably incurious about the most important figure in their Jedi Order, or every inquiry went nowhere productive. And in a galaxy that documented the dietary habits of species that appeared once in a crowd shot, the failure to document Yoda's origins requires more explanation than casual oversight. The Minch problem, at its core, isn't really about whether one name belongs to one being or two. It's the crack in a much larger structure. If Lucas's pre-production naming choices and Lucasfilm's canonical decisions can produce an unresolved institutional contradiction about something as specific as a character's identity, one that neither party has chosen to settle in the years since it became visible, then the larger absence around the species carries a different weight. Gaps get filled. This one has been actively maintained across creative regimes, across decades, across the most commercially significant franchise restructuring in entertainment history. Lucas designed the silence from the beginning. Filoni confirmed it remained intact in the Disney era. The policy survived every transition intact. 7 appearances across 4,000 years of galactic civilization. A species name the galaxy never recorded. A homeworld no chart has ever located. After every war, every council, every republic, and every empire, across the entire documented span of galactic history, nobody made them tell us. Across all of it, they sent their people out one at a time to stand at the exact pressure points where history could break either way. And then they took them back into silence, or let them be consumed by the darkness they'd been sent to oppose, and left no forwarding address. Whether that's a lore gap or exactly what they wanted is the question the franchise has been refusing to answer for 40 years. The refusal itself is the answer. Subscribe for more stories like this.